Hello and welcome to Chapter 6 for PA 315, and this is Congress. So the roots of the U.S. Congress are found, of course, in the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 7 and 8. And what we have in this country, which is somewhat unique, though many other countries have a similar system, looking at Mexico and Canada and others, which is a bicameral legislature, which, as we spoke about before, is separated into the House of Representatives and the Senate. And this was part of the compromise in the drafting of the Constitution between smaller states and larger states. The larger states, of course, when I say large, I mean by population. The larger states wanted representation based upon population, and the smaller states wanted representation to be equal among the states. So what was formed was an upper house and a lower house, the upper house being the Senate, with 2 senators from each state elected to a 6-year term. Currently, there are 100, 2 for each state. And representation in the House is based on population, and they're elected to a 2-year term. And the idea is that these are closer to the people. There should be more elections more often. And the Senate originally, as we've discussed before, was actually chosen by state legislatures until the 20th century, early 20th century. So the House now is 435 members, and this came about with the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929. So what happened is they had 435 members. They said, this is it. There'll never be more than 435. And so in the future, we're going to do an apportionment, which is after each census, we're going to allocate to each state a certain number of representatives. And you've seen it change vastly over the years. Originally, it was around 30,000 per representative. Now it's well over 700,000. We just had a census come through in 2020, and actually California lost a seat. And the reason it lost a seat is not because California shrunk. California actually grew by a little over 6%, but because it grew slower than the United States as a whole, which grew at about 7.5%. So now California has 52 representatives where it had 53, and other states like Michigan lost a representative, Ohio, a lot of the old Rust Belt states lost a representative, and states like Texas, which is growing rapidly, gained 2 representatives. Now they have 38. So we've seen this body grow. It actually was largest at 437, excuse me, and then was brought back to 435 in the 60s. So Congress, most important thing, of course, as we've discussed, is lawmaking. And right now, we're seeing that over and over again, that it's become a very political process. Whichever party is in power really controls what the agenda is in Congress and the types of laws that are even considered. Watch the video explaining the bicameral Congress. That's in Module 3. That's a better explanation than I can give about the bicameral Congress. So if we look at the powers of Congress, they're articulated in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and they include the power to lay and collect taxes and duties, borrow money, regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the states. As we discussed, states cannot negotiate with other states separate trade agreements. That is only the power given through Congress. And any sort of deal between states of any sort has to be approved by Congress. They establish rules for naturalization, the process of becoming a citizen, for bankruptcy, coining money, setting its value, fixing the standard of weights and measures. When I was young, there was discussion on changing the system that we use in this country from the English system to the metric system like the rest of the world. And growing up, we thought it was inevitable the United States would change to that. That never came to be. We are very stubborn here. We don't like change. Congress also can punish counterfeiting. Congress established a post office and post roads. They issue patents and copyrights. They define and punish piracies, felonies on the high seas, and crimes against the law of nations. They create the federal courts, so courts that are below the US Supreme Court. They declare war, raise and support an army and navy, and make rules for their governance. Of course, army and navy also includes other branches of the military that we have now, the Marines, Space Force, etc. They provide for a militia and also reserve the right for the states to appoint militia officers and to train militias under congressional rules. So a state just can't create militias on their own. They have to have the approval of Congress. They exercise legislative powers over the seat of government, that's the District of Columbia, and over places purchased to be federal facilities, forts, arsenals, dockyards, bases overseas, etc. And most importantly, make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all the other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. This is the necessary and proper clause, which opens up a very wide spectrum of laws that can take place in order to not only support enumerated laws, but implied. So the key constitutional differences between the House of Representatives and the Senate. So as we know, the House now has 435 members. That's apportioned by population. 100 voting members. In the Senate, that's 2 from each state. You have 2-year terms versus 6-year terms. The Senate, approximately 1/3 are up for re-election every 2 years. Obviously, it can't be because it doesn't divide by 3 evenly. You have the House initiating all revenue bills. They have the power of the purse. That's in the House. And the Senate, on the other hand, offers advice and consent on major presidential appointments. That's judges, different other executive branch appointments. They have to be approved by the Senate. The House can initiate impeachment procedures and passes articles of impeachment. We saw that happen twice in the last couple years with the former president. However, the Senate tries those impeached officials. So an article of impeachment can go through, as it did with President Trump as well as President Clinton. However, the Senate has to try it, and it's very difficult. You need a supermajority to convict, which has never happened to a president. It's happened to other government officials. The Senate also has a unique power, and that's approving treaties and presidential appointments of all sorts. So how well does the House of Representatives reflect the American people? Now, this is old, and I apologize for that. I couldn't find an updated graph, but this is from 2016. Obviously, this has changed. In 2018, the majority became Democrat. So that is different. And in 2020, it's still majority Democrat, albeit a few seats more for the Republicans. Gender, obviously, is not well represented. You have a massive number of men and few women, though that has changed. It's been increasing slightly, especially in 2018. The percentage of US households that are millionaires is only 4%, yet in 2016, the percentage of the US Congress that are millionaires was 51%. So that shows you demographically, there's a disconnect there. And as you look at the different other demographics, such as race, it's vastly white, though that's gotten slightly better the last 2 Congresses. And religion, it's not representative either. You have a massive Protestant representation and Catholic, and everything else is very small. So representational strategies, there's 2 lines of thought, and really there's 3, but there's 2 main ways of acting as a representative from your district or your state. Edmund Burke, who was a conservative British politician, put forth the trustee, And the trustee is an elected representative who uses their own judgment despite wishes of majority. So the trustee may vote with the majority if they feel it's right. However, they are being voted, they're being trusted to have a better informed opinion than the majority is essentially the rationale. And so they will vote against things the majority wants, sometimes for the best interests of the majority. At least that's the line of thinking. A delegate mentality, the elected representative follows the wishes of constituents. So generally the majority. So a delegate would just vote whatever the constituents, either in their district or in the state, would want. And that's the way they go. However, today the best explanation of the style uses Politico. And this is an alternative type of representation, and it depends on the issue, whether they'll vote with their own judgment or based on the wishes of constituents. And you also have to bring in here that the political party, as well as different caucuses, come into play on how the representative will vote. So in some cases, they'll vote against the majority if that's perhaps in what their caucus suggests or what the party suggests, or perhaps they'll vote with the constituents on certain items that are very politically strong in their district or state, especially wedge issues, as we read in the text. So regardless of strategy, elected representatives usually conform to the wishes of their party and financial backers. There's a few cases where that's not the case, but they don't want to jeopardize their chances of reelection. As we read in the text, 96% of incumbents win. So when we see these changeovers in Congress, usually that's because you have representatives who are retiring, or maybe they're running for Senate or governor, so they're no longer running for their seat. So these seats become open. It's very rare when a representative runs that they lose. And there's lots of reasons for that, which we discussed in the text and we'll talk about in a second here. So what are the advantages of incumbency? So incumbency means you're already in office and you're running again. Of course, it's name recognition. Members' names have been on the ballot before. Voters associate their names with programs or social services brought to the district, whether that was all of them or not. This leads into credit claiming. Members claim responsible for federal money brought to the district or any projects, things of that nature. Casework. So members and their staffs help their constituents solve problems with government, including navigating red tape, tracking down federal aid, etc. So that means they're building allies, building a network within their district or state. Franking privilege, this is very important. Members of Congress may send mail or newsletters for free by using their signature in place of a stamp. This gives them a massive advantage over someone running against them. And because sending mass mailings, especially if you're running for Senate, is very expensive. Access to media. Again, if you're an incumbent, you've started to build a network with media. So you know the people, you know who to talk to, you know their staff members. And so you have this mouthpiece where you can spin the story to give yourself an advantage, give quotes, etc. Ease in fundraising. Again, a network has been built as an incumbent. And this is probably one of the primary reasons. So they've already have a group of very wealthy donors and wealthy groups that are giving them money. So it's difficult to compete with that. And often these donations are given, though not explicitly stated, but in exchange for access, influence, experience in running a campaign. Experience also always helps. And redistricting. So we're going to discuss this more in a second. But in the House, a member's district may be drawn to enhance electability. And we see this in states. And this gives advantages to the party in power at the state level. So that can really help certain candidates. In some cases, it can hurt them. If the party in power at the state level is not the same as the congressperson, then perhaps they could redistrict. And now it's not as favorable to them as they were in the past. However, if you look at the districting now across the United States, it's very, very much in favor of the party that's has the seat. There's very few cases where you have an even representation. So redistricting, and we're going to be seeing that, as I just talked about. California is losing a seat, even though it grew in population, to states like Texas and Florida. And when we think of redistricting, we think of creating these districts. We think of gerrymandering. And as we read in the text, gerrymandering is named after Governor, I think, Elbridge Gerry, who was in Massachusetts in the early 19th century. And he's the one who started doing this to make sure that his party, which were the Democratic Republicans, this is a precursor to the modern parties. This was the party that was created by Thomas Jefferson and Madison, to make sure that they would retain power. And so you change the district borders in order to maximize your chances of winning as far as that party. And it was called Mander because they said it looked like a salamander, and hence gerrymander, and it's stuck ever since. Now, in most states, redistricting is done by state legislatures. So you see the problem there. The party in power generally controls this process. However, some states have changed the rule. Arizona is one, and there's some other states. And this hopefully is growing, that many other states are looking for an impartial, objective way to set up districts, because it can get very bizarre. Supreme Court cases in 2016 and 17, you did see some action there, though it's a fairly conservative court. And some states were forced to redraw districts due to a highly racial or partisan practice. So in the case of Texas, you saw issues with race brought up, and so they had to go back. This is, again, where I'm going to have you make sure that you're watching the videos in the module and watch the short video explaining gerrymandering in module 3, and that gives you a good overview of this process. So House of Representatives and Senate structures. I apologize, this is this is from 2016. And so here we have Republican being the majority. Now that is switched. Since 2018, you have the Democrats as the majority. The House of Representatives has a speaker, which is chosen by the House of Representatives. Generally, that is chosen by the party that is the majority. Most often, 99% of the time, they will put someone forth, and then they'll all vote for that person, and they become the speaker. Currently, of course, it's Nancy Pelosi. She served as speaker before, and now she's been speaker again since 2019. Slight differences between the Democrats and Republicans, but fairly similar. Each party has a majority or minority leader. There's a majority whip or a minority whip, and their job is, like it sounds, is to whip everyone into shape to make sure people are voting and to get the score, who's voting for what, to see if they have enough votes to push forth legislation. You have the Republican conference, and then you have the Democratic caucus. It's really, they're both caucuses. And you have steering and policy committee for the Democrats, congressional campaign committee. Republicans have those, as well as a policy committee. They separate policy and steering. Senate, the vice president or president pro tem presides over the Senate, and often they don't. There's actually others, lower level members of the majority party will sit in when the vice president or president pro tempore is not available to preside over the Senate. It's kind of not a very powerful position. The only time it becomes a powerful position is when the vice president is allowed to vote on matters of a tie. So if it's 50-50, the vice president can vote whichever way, usually in the way of their party, to break that tie. And right now we are at 50-50 with the parties in the Senate, but the vice president is a Democrat, which makes the Democrats the majority in the Senate as well, though very slim majority, which is difficult. So as again, you see there's a majority or minority leader, you have majority or minority whips, and then you have a caucus and conference, the same as above, little bit different. The Republicans have an extra committee. as well as the Democrats in the Senate. So Speaker of the House presides over the House. They have the power to recognize members to speak and make motions, which is very, very powerful. So they have the power to kind of control the dialogue within when House is in session. They also have a very important power, and that's appoint members to conference committees, especially choosing the chairs of committees. That really can dictate what is going to be on the agenda. They're nominated by the majority party, but the entire House votes. Usually, one whole party will vote for whoever they have nominated, and that's that. They are the third in line to presidency. So if something happens to the president and vice president, the Speaker of the House becomes president and is by far the most powerful position in the House. As we discussed, you have majority leaders. Currently in the House, it's Steny Hoyer from Maryland, a Democrat. They're second in line to the Speaker of the House, and they will sometimes preside over the session. And you have a minority leader who's currently Kevin McCarthy, a Republican, and the whips for both. And those are kind of the enforcers. If there's a show called House of Cards a while back that was interesting, and the character started as he was the whip and then worked his way up to president, and he was pretty corrupt and it was a lot of scandal, but it's an interesting show. So 116th Congress, we're actually on the 117th now. And this was after 2018. And next year, I'm actually changing the text to the new version, which will have 2020. I apologize. But it's not too different, 116th and 117th. So as you can see, there is growing racial and ethnic diversity in Congress with the 116th, albeit nothing close to what it should be according to the demographics of the country. You will see red and blue. You see a lot of red there, and the red generally, as we know, is in less populated areas, not always, but generally, and blue is in very highly populated urban areas is majority Democrat. And that's fairly true throughout all the states. The committee system is how anything gets done. And the types of committees, there's several. You have your standing committees, and these are permanent. So they're always going to be around regardless of Congress, which Congress is 117th or 118th or whatever. And these generally represent the different departments, the 15, and we'll discuss this later in the semester, but the 15 different executive departments. There's usually a committee for each. And as well as other committees, rules committees, as well as apportionment and appropriations, things like that. Joint committees are important. They include members of both the Senate and House. And these are appointed on special issues where they want to get both houses working together on something. Conference committees are very important. They're created to resolve disputes on bills, and they are a joint committee. And so basically with a conference committee, oftentimes you'll see the House and Senate coming in with a bill that's similar, and the conference committee's job is to work with the committees from each of the Senate and the House to come up with a compromise for both to vote on. And you have select or special committees, and these are put forth, like here you see with Watergate and other things, and they are usually more partisan and political than substantive. So committee chairs selected by majority party, often nominated by the speaker. The ranking member is selected by the minority party. Generally, committees have about a 50-50 makeup with Democrats and Republicans. However, on certain committees, we saw Rules Committee for one, generally the party in power, the majority party, will have a 2/3 majority. And watch the video in Module 3, Congressional Committees, and it explains committees better than I can. So the lawmaking function, is a long process, and it's very difficult to get a bill to become a law. And first thing is that any bill that's proposed is referred to committee. The congressional committee then does what's called markup. So they debate, add, subtract portions, and rewrites proposed legislation. Now, generally, a bill is referred to a committee and then is referred to a subcommittee. We'll go over that in a second, which does a lot of the grunt work, and then back to the committee. Only if the committee votes to move ahead is there floor debate. In the House, there's a way to control this. If people aren't showing up or they don't want to vote on something, they can have committee of the whole, which is you need at least 100 members of the House to show up, and then they can vote and move ahead with something. This is to avoid just whole parties not showing up to vote on things, to avoid it, let's say, controversial vote. In the Senate, you have the filibuster, which is from a Dutch word for pirate. And this is when someone just stands up there and just babbles on for hours and hours until the time is up and no one votes on anything. And to stop a filibuster in the Senate, which only the Senate can do, the House cannot do this, you need a vote of cloture, which is, as you read in the text, 60 of 100 have to vote, which is difficult to get when you're split 50-50. Final approval, the president can sign the bill into law, he can or she can veto, and then the House and Senate must both have 2/3 to overturn, and that happens very rarely. It happened last time, I believe, in the 70s. They can do nothing for 10 days while Congress is in session, and then it just becomes law, or they can do what's called a pocket veto. If they're holding on to it, to do nothing, and then Congress adjourns. And if they adjourn, before 10 days, then that's, called a pocket veto. That's rare too. So as we see, oftentimes you have a bill introduced and it's introduced in both houses. In both cases, Senate and House, it's referred to the House committee that's appropriate or the Senate committee. And then they will refer it to a subcommittee that does a lot more of the grunt work, more specific to what this issue is. And it could stop at either point there. The House committee initially could say, or the Senate, forget it, we don't want to go forward. Or they give it to the subcommittee says, we don't want to go forward. But if they do, they vote to go forward, it's reported by the full committee. And then in the case of the House, it's referred to the Committee on Rules, which, as you read in the text, is a very important committee. So the Committee on Rules basically decides what can be negotiated or what can be added or amended to the bill. In some cases, it'll be closed, which means you can't do anything. It's either as is or not. Or in some cases, they'll have specific ideas on what can be changed. And again, Committee on Rules is controlled by the majority party. They'll also decide in the Committee on Rules whether, how much time for debate, etc. All of the agenda, putting it forth to the agenda, and they can stop a bill right in its tracks. Senate doesn't have that. The Senate's smaller, and there's more of an emphasis on each individual senator being able to discuss and debate and add amendments to the bills. And so it's a different process. Then you could have the filibuster, which could derail that. Back to the House, the full House debates and votes on passage. Generally, you don't have the same amount of individual representatives coming up with amendments and such at this point. It's just too big of a body for that to be practical. And either votes yay or nay. And if they both vote yes, and it's a similar issue, then it goes to the conference committee. So the conference committee is made up of House members and Senate members who are working on this, and they try to reach a deal, a compromise, and then it goes again for House and Senate approval. So as you can see, that can be difficult in itself. From there, it goes to the president where he can sign it, veto, or wait 10 days and Congress adjourns for a pocket veto. So it is a long process. And that's why we don't have many bills that become laws. If you read in the text, I think there was 12,000 bills proposed, and only 100 or so, 150 or so were even debated during a congressional session. So it's just, most bills die. So congressional budgetary process, it's important. Congress, again, controls the purse strings, but you have the president submitting the budget to Congress, and this was a later act in the 1970s, which changed the structure and made sure that the president submitting the budget to Congress, it's prepared by the Office of Management and Budget, as had been done since 1921 with the first law regarding the budget process, which allowed the president to present a budget. However, later in the 70s, Congress came back and said, well, Office of Management and Budget, they're under the executive branch. We can't always count on their forecasts and projections to be accurate. They could be skewed and biased. So they created the Congressional Budget Office, which then looks at the budget and makes their own projections. So it's a way to check and balance. February 15th, budget outlook. So now the Congressional Budget Office submits economic projections to the House and Senate budget committees. April 15th, the budget resolution. So Congress, Senate, and House must complete action on the initial version of a budget resolution. May 15th, appropriation begins. So appropriation bills are spending bills, so they have to decide how they're going to spend the money. And June 10th, the Appropriations Committee, which is a very powerful committee in the House, concludes consideration of appropriations issues, so everything has to be done by then. And reconciliation ends June 15th. So any reconciliation bills have to be done by this date, and then you have appropriation ending on June 30th, and they have to conclude consideration of all appropriation bills. And we've seen in the last 10, 15 years, this can be a problem and things can get pushed further and further into the year, but generally they want it done by then, in time for October 1st, which is the fiscal year for government. Government doesn't go by January 1st. The beginning of the government year is October 1st. Then it ends September 30th. So oversight in Congress has manifested in several different ways. The War Powers Resolution, the War Powers Act in 1973. And this was created really reacting to the Vietnam War, and you had the president, which were several presidents prior to this date who had just let armed forces stay in Vietnam. And you had tens of thousands of Americans killed and millions of Vietnamese killed during this war. And they said, no, we can't have this. Based on the Constitution, we have the power to wage war, and it never wasn't officially voted on in Congress. So we need something to control the powers of the president, because the president, as commander-in-chief, can send troops into war. So this forbade armed forces from remaining for more than 60 days, plus a 30-day withdrawal period, without congressional authorization, both houses, or a declaration of war by Congress. So the Congress has to approve of any long-term actions. President Nixon at the time didn't like it. He liked a lot of executive power, and he vetoed it. However, Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, did override the veto to pass the law, which is, I think, the last time that's happened. Impeachment, as we've seen, the House of Representatives votes on articles of impeachment. They need just a simple majority, and we saw that happen twice with former President Trump. After the impeachment, the Senate holds hearings and votes to convict or not, and needs 2/3 of senators, so 67, supermajority, to convict, and that just never happens. It's too political, too partisan. Only 3 presidents had articles of impeachment against them. That's Andrew Johnson, as we read in the text, who tried to challenge Congress when with changing the Secretary of War at the time, which was illegal at the time, as he was confirmed by the Senate under President Lincoln before he was assassinated. Bill Clinton with the Monica Lewinsky affair, and Donald Trump on 2 occasions, one for Russian interference and the other for an obstruction of justice, and then the other for incitement for an insurrection. But as we saw, none of them were convicted by the Senate. Now, in the case of Nixon, after this vote where he saw Congress in a bipartisan way override his veto, he saw the writing on the wall. And so before the impeachment vote was to take place, he resigned and then was pardoned by President Ford. I guess he didn't feel Congress would be so nice with him and that he would be convicted over Watergate scandal. Confirmation of presidential appointees, the Senate. 51 senators required, except for Supreme Court nominees. Now you need 60 to avoid filibuster. That's with anything now, and the filibuster really has made that supermajority 60 necessary to produce cloture. Senatorial courtesy, presidential appointments are confirmed if no objection by the senators from the appointee's state of service. That used to be the case. Now it's kind of disappeared as we've gotten more and more partisan. So influences on decision-making. Obviously, political parties are the biggest influence, and they are gatekeepers to campaign funding and control the political hierarchy and narrative, and generally have vetted most of their candidates fairly well, though we're seeing some splinters in the Republican Party especially, and as well as the Democrats now. So to get through that power of the party, even to be elected, you're going to be vetted that you're going to be a good party soldier, which has led to a lot of nothing happening in Congress, unfortunately. So the parties generally, as we read in the text, about 90% of the time, the elected official will vote with their party. So that's pretty much most every time. On the other hand, constituents, that's the people, the electorate who live, work, vote in the member's district, the voters, or the state, that usually the representative votes 67% of the time with what the constituents prefer. So that shows you right there who really holds the power with political parties at 90% versus 67%. Interest groups, lobbyists, and PACs, these are very intermingled in with political parties. However, especially we're seeing now with the super PACs can form different blocks within parties, like we see with the Freedom Caucus and Tea Party movements within the Republican Party. And they disseminate research or generally propaganda to justify specific positions for legislation. Their massive fundraising through PACs really influence specific private agenda items, all of these negative ads we see. And the pay for play or quid pro quo is often assumed there, though not explicitly. Colleagues and caucuses, that used to have a little more weight, not as much anymore. However, you still see issues of log rolling, as we read in the text. That's you're supporting, let's say, another member's legislation for some issue that doesn't really affect you in exchange for future support, meaning that when you have some issue where, let's say, the federal money is coming to your district or state, that they'll support you. So scratch your back, you scratch mine. Special interest caucuses, informal groups based on shared interests, they will have some say, but usually are pretty tied in with the political parties. And there's rare that there's differences, though there are in both parties. Staff and support agencies, each member of Congress has staff to assist during their term in office. Senate is around 35 members, Congress about 15 to 18. Congressional Research Service, that's part of the Library of Congress, and that provides policy and legal analysis as well to committees, as well as information, other analyses, and that's for both the House and Senate. And this is a nonpartisan group. It's supposed to have no sway either way. You have the Governmental Accountability Office, which used to be called the General Accounting Office. and that provides auditing, evaluation, and investigative services for the US Congress over executive branch departments. So it's to control spending, see where things are going, and to make sure there's not as much corruption as, well, there should be no corruption, to fight corruption and to fight poor management and to be more efficient and effective. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, we talked about, was created in 1974, and that provides budget and economic information to Congress. Again, these are all nonpartisan objective groups. They're not affiliated with any party. So Congress and the executive, as we spoke about before with President Andrew Johnson, what brought his impeachment was the Congress wanted to preserve the different cabinet members who were appointed and approved by the Senate under President Lincoln. And they felt that Andrew Johnson was too sympathetic toward the South, and he was wanting to change certain members and remake it to a very, he wasn't a big fan of Reconstruction, let's just put it that way. So this law made that any federal official whose appointment was required by Senate confirmation could not be removed without the consent of the Senate. So you could have these people in these department positions for very long times unless the Senate votes to get rid of them. And this was repealed in 1887 by Congress. Obviously, it proved problematic if you have a president coming in and they can't choose their executive branch members, and it probably gave a bit too much power to certain secretaries of different departments who were there for long periods of time. Generally, the power of the president and executive branch has fluctuated, but it has grown, especially since the 1930s. Some people think it's grown too far. Congress and the judiciary, you have judicial review, and this is very important. We're going to talk more about this in the later chapter on the judiciary, but Supreme Court can determine if legislation is constitutional or not. And in our history, where about 180 different laws have been struck down by the Supreme Court that were approved by Congress. So it does happen. Congress also has jurisdiction of federal courts. So ultimately, they created these courts, and they can change them or remove them if they wish. Congress and the people, and Congress is supposed to serve the best interests of their diverse constituency and all citizenry, though we've seen that this is a challenge, especially with big money elections and the problems associated with that. So finally, what do Americans think about Congress? As you can see over the last 40 plus years, not too highly. September 98, you saw, a little bit over 50%, but ever since then, it's been downhill quite a bit. And right now, it's roughly around 33% approval rating, or excuse me, the average since 1974 is 33% approval rating, which is terrible. And currently 31% approval rating, which is not good. 65% disapprove of Congress, so a super majority almost. 4% had no opinion. However, 51% feel their own representative should be reelected, and that's the issue. All you need is 51%, and then you see that 96% of incumbents winning. So basically, people are saying, well, we don't trust Congress. We think it's awful. However, our guy or gal is okay, which ultimately is a conundrum. So make sure you are watching the videos for this chapter. And next up, we will have the study session for the Exam 1 study guide.